So I thought about something regarding implicit versus explicit knowledge. For example, opposition to eating shellfish. Say you're in the Levant in 500 BC. Now what happens is that, as an evolutionary process, groups that prohibited eating shellfish outcompeted groups that did not outlaw eating shellfish. Now, maybe there are a few clan elders who can tell you why, but the rank and file, they can't tell you, and maybe they'd say something like it's an affront to God. Whatever, that's all they need. They don't need to know anymore. They just need to know to do thing, or not do thing. Now, if some liberal-minded person comes along who thinks for himself, he may say something like, "Tut tut, your opposition to eating shellfish is mere superstition. Don't be held back by superstitious beliefs. You're preventing yourself from exploiting an entire food source by that silly religious text." And what would happen to such a group is they would eat the shellfish, they'd start getting sick, and the disease would spread. And back then, a bunch of them would die. And maybe they would think God was punishing them for eating shellfish. They don't know about germs, obviously, but it doesn't matter because their silly, superstitious beliefs worked. And so the filter of evolution, be it of an organism, a group of people, a class, or a human class competing with each other, they contain in themselves embedded knowledge. And we can call this the implicit knowledge of conservative beliefs or traditional beliefs. Now, when I say conservative, I don't mean like in the U.S. political context. I mean the small c conservative. Now, today, because we have more information than they had in the past, we can say you have to prepare shellfish in a certain way. Maybe you can't eat certain parts that seem edible. I don't know the specifics, but we have knowledge today that allows you to eat shellfish. And so this particular conservative sanction is no longer necessary. More recently, an example of this would be the legalization of homosexuality. Now, we know in practice that groups which prohibited homosexuality outcompeted groups that did not prohibit it. The problem is that before mass communication, they didn't really have to deal with liberal ideas coming in and demanding some sort of a logical explanation for this. But what has happened with mass communication is that these conservative sanctions, or conservative values we could say, are now having to logically defend themselves when they didn't come about as a sort of logical chain of reasoning. They came about through an evolutionary process that just worked. And I think of a group of fishers in Newfoundland. Canada had this environmental team that was tasked to preserve freshwater stocks in Canada, and they had all sorts of fancy schmancy models to estimate how many fish could be caught at any given location that would be sustainable. So they went to this particular group of Newfies and told them that they were radically underfishing the fish in their area and that they could actually fish more than they were. And so the Newfies were like, "Oh, we can fish more." Okay. And so they did. And they ended up overfishing, and they had to stop fishing for multiple years to resupply the stocks. And then they returned to their traditional quotas, which were much lower than what the big brains told them. And this is an example of explicit knowledge underperforming implicit knowledge. And of course, I'm not saying, don't misunderstand me here. There are advantages and disadvantages to both. But people need to be not so ideological about this stuff and just always think explicit knowledge is good and implicit knowledge is just dumb superstitions, which is the most common form of bias on this. Less common is the conservative bias towards implicit knowledge. More common is the bias in favor of explicit knowledge. And I think a problem in scientists is they end up being biased in favor of explicit beliefs over implicit beliefs to the point where they end up, instead of just dispassionately exploring positions, they just try to debunk all implicit beliefs. And what a heterodox scientist nowadays are really just those scientists who aren't so much like that. Either they're only mildly biased in favor of explicit beliefs to where it doesn't cloud their judgment, or they're true neutral or close to it, or they are in fact a scientist biased in favor of implicit beliefs, and they set about trying to reify the implicit beliefs. That is to convert implicit beliefs into explicit propositions. Take something like gender differences in behavior. Implicit belief is that they are biological and innate. In evolutionary history, they didn't know what genes were, so innateness doesn't necessarily even refer to a purely genetic mechanism, but given what we know genes do now, that's how you would translate that. That's how you would reify the implicit belief. And I think you have a class of scientists for whom science is just debunking implicit beliefs. So science to them means debunking biological gender differences. If you're the reification of implicit beliefs and saying, no, this implicit belief was actually correct, this old-timey belief, they didn't know at the time why it worked, but now we do know why it worked. Here's why it worked. That's the process of reification. To a certain set of people, that's anti-scientific, right? In fact, that would be, this is just pseudoscience mumbo jumbo trying to cloak the veneer of science over their old bigotries, as opposed to saying, no, obviously implicit beliefs evolved for some reason. Now, that reason could be a bad reason, right? It could be false, but it could also be, this practice evolved, or this belief evolved because it was correct, and these in the pre-scientific age, they didn't know why it was correct, just that it was correct. And so just for science to be just the debunking of implicit beliefs, this is called progressive science for some reason, but really it's just the tyranny of the explicit. But see, overwhelming evidence in favor of innateness in behavior, which is what I'm referring to, biological innate gender differences, to them, that's not scientific, even though, right, because science is defined as the refutation of implicit beliefs in them. Ironically, that's kind of an implicit belief they have, not something they explicate, because as soon as they explicate it, it's obviously really stupid. But there's also a bias against this because of the equalist mania, which is a whole topic in and of itself. But I think there's also just a general bias against reifying implicit beliefs. Now, the advantage of explicit knowledge is that it's the only way to advance past sort of your evolutionary environment. Hopefully there's no argument here. Explicit knowledge is required for, like, the internal combustion engine, for example. So, for society to advance, you must engage in very high amounts of behavior based on explicit knowledge. But that's riskier. You have to take risks to advance. You can't just stick to the old ways, which, even though they work within a limited range. And the disadvantage of explicit knowledge, or the advantage of implicit knowledge, is that it inherently takes into account and properly weights all relevant factors over time. Even the practitioners of implicit knowledge practices haven't the slightest clue of what those factors are, even if it's just some religious text telling them to behave X way, because that was all a product of multiple generations of trial and error and survival of the fittest. It definitionally takes into account all relevant factors. And so what this means is that implicit knowledge, even if the rationale is dumb, or commonly there's no reason given at all, will often take into account factors that a liberal scientist who's only looking at explicit knowledge doesn't even know to consider. Of course, the practitioners of implicit knowledge don't know to consider some hidden variable either. They just, by trial and error, end up effectively accounting for it, even if they don't know that's what they're doing. So, and I see sort of a parallel here looking at, say, actually that's not quite a parallel, because because quantitative genetics would be more in the category of explicit versus implicit knowledge. Although comparing quantitative genetics to molecular genetics, quantitative genetics would be more implicit, would be more implicit than molecular genetics. Molecular genetics being find the genes and actually find the genetic mechanisms by which we see differences in behavior in people, whereas quantitative genetics is just, twin studies, kinship studies, and other ways of and also just sort of going through, propose environmental hypotheses and trying to quantify the effects of that through natural experimentation. So quantitative genetics, compared to most things in the world, is an extremely explicit form of knowledge. It definitely falls in the category on the spectrum. It definitely falls well into the category of explicit knowledge. It's just that molecular genetics is at the tippy top of explicit knowledge, whereas quantitative genetics is, compared to that, kind of implicit, because you're not saying, well, we don't know the exact molecular genetic mechanisms that cause these differences. We just know they're there because we know these heritability estimates accurately predict what we see in ensuing generations. So, quantitative genetics is definitely, in the grand scheme of things, it's a very explicit form of knowledge, but compared to molecular genetics, it's implicit, just compared to that. So when liberal scientists, and I use liberal here not in the modern political context, although there may be some relation, I'm using it to denote the kinds of knowledge being employed. A liberal scientist, or scientific-minded thinker, may look at prohibitions on homosexuality as just pig-headed superstition. And in a debate, the implicit knowledge person will get creamed because he has no logical rationale for anti-homosexual sanctions. But to think that means anything is stupid, because explicit knowledge was generated through logical reasoning. Implicit knowledge evolved by an entirely different process. And all a debate does is demand that the implicit position defend itself on explicit terms. And yeah, in that debate, it's almost always going to lose unless it has been reified and converted into an explicit proposition. But to the extent it hasn't been fully reified, it's almost certainly going to lose, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. Or say religion. This is what makes explicit thinkers so silly when criticizing religion. They go through these texts and they go, aha, this doesn't make sense. We know this is factually incorrect. How stupid these religious people are, blah, blah, blah. And they're missing the point. The religion is there because groups that were religious outcompeted groups that were not religious. And like trying to debunk religious texts or finding contradictions within them, you're fundamentally misunderstanding what this is and what the purpose is. For most of religion's history, most people never even read the Bible or the Quran or even the Torah, though a greater percentage of Jews read the Torah than the other two. But even then, it wasn't anything close to a majority. Now, this is where I start saying things that some people might not agree with. Most people evolved to just kind of accept narratives, and the contradictions don't really matter, because you got to think about the world in terms of pre-industrial, pre-literate group conflict. Say a group doesn't allow females to engage in certain professions and gives men all sorts of authority over females, but the patron deity of this clan or whatever is a woman. You could say this is a kind of contradiction, but you have to think, does this contradiction really matter in terms of intergroup conflict? And the only belief contradictions that actually would get ironed out in pre-literate populations are contradictions that actually mattered. And something like, God has infinite mercy and love for all those created in his image, and all adulterers go to hell. Okay, that contradiction there, that it doesn't matter. You can accept the contradiction, and you can have those contradictory beliefs, and is it gonna reduce your group's competitiveness? If the answer is no, then that contradiction doesn't matter. You know, it's something like God is all-knowing, all-present, all-powerful, but having your people who believe in this God suffer and get slaughtered or die from plagues, that contradiction doesn't matter as long as they hold to the religion and the religion sort of maintains group cohesion. From a group evolutionary perspective, many, if not most, of the egregious contradictions of belief just don't matter. Because on the whole, what's the implicit knowledge in religion? Well, it's that groups that have fervent religious beliefs outcompete groups that don't. And when some smarty pants go, oh, well, we're going to be atheists because of all the contradictions and false statements in the religion, well, you're probably going to lose. Because you're focused on the explicit content of the religion, which is mostly irrelevant, not 100% irrelevant, but is mostly irrelevant, instead of the implicit lesson in the existence of the religion. And in terms of the practices of religion, or any kind of what we class as traditional practices, a stupid question is, does this make logical sense? That is, brainlet kind of questioning there. A smart question would be to ask, why did this evolve? Now, the answer to why this evolved could just be a spandrel. This group could have just outcompeted other groups for reasons that have nothing to do with that particular practice, or it could have just been luck. And when that's the case, that's the case. And then they then spawned other groups which bear similarities to them that maintain this spandrel. But sometimes the traditional practices outcompeted the other groups for reasons that eludes explicit knowledge. Say you have some island people, and there are oranges on the island, and they have a tradition that say they must eat the rind of the orange, not just the tasty inside of the orange. And then some explorers come in who have explicit knowledge of diet. And their explicit knowledge is that food is made up of 3 elements: carbohydrates, fat, and protein. Those are the 3 elements, and what you need is a balance of the 3. And they tell these island people that the rind contains none of these nutrients, and so they just throw away the rind and just juice the oranges. And the island people do so, and so they overeat the oranges and get diabetes and obesity. Now, with more modern explicit knowledge of nutrition, we know why it's a good idea to eat the rind of an orange and why juicing is bad. And so a modern nutritionist would not give that kind of advice. Better explicit knowledge would not give that advice. But the point is that incomplete explicit knowledge can lose out to implicit knowledge. I forget what I said. Incomplete explicit knowledge can lose out to implicit knowledge that is inherently complete in the context in which the traditional practice evolved. Okay? So, obviously, the further you advance, the more you know, the more explicit knowledge you can employ, and the less you need to rely on implicit traditional practices. But if your explicit knowledge is immature, then implicit knowledge can regularly beat them because implicit knowledge is inherently more complete at its starting point. So, talking about all this, the obvious issue that is related to all this, implicit versus explicit knowledge, is robots. I mean, obviously, we can all see how this relates to robots. What I think going forward with the rise of machines and mechanical minds, we'll say, for a while, is I think going to be a symbiotic relation between humans and synthetic intelligence. The problems with machines are well known. They're obvious, and they're often humorously portrayed in fiction, right? And you have little examples of robots. They keep trying to wax the floors and tend the garden 200 years after it's been abandoned. Or they keep running a concession stand after the stock is empty, or vigorously enforce some stupid rule, right? We all know, sort of in a kind of a humorous way, inherently what the problems of an improperly constructed explicit mechanical mind would be. So we seem to be keenly aware of the greater efficiencies of synthetic intelligence, but also the pitfalls, because again, it's explicit versus implicit creation process, sort of a top-down constructed process versus an evolved process. Bottom-up organism creation is far more limited in its pathways, but it inherently adapts to all the relevant environmental factors. It is inherently complete and ends up evolving all sorts of strange things that seem like spandrels, but that are actually adaptations to some really obscure thing a designer may never imagine. Maybe my views on this are outdated, but I saw a little article on chatbots, and there were these 2 chatbots that were told to negotiate a trade with each other, and they developed their own shorthand and started speaking in ways that are strange and incomprehensible to humans. This was apparently run by Facebook, and they reacted to this by shutting down the chatbots. And there were some quotes from the researchers that I found very misguided. Quote, "In the first place, it's entirely text-based, while human languages are all basically spoken or gestured, with text being an artificial overlay," he wrote on his blog. "And beyond that, it's unclear that this process yields a system with the kind of word, phrase, and sentence structure characteristic of human languages. Now, I'm constantly shocked at how much this attitude persists in people working on AI or things approaching AI, even if it's just a chatbot, which is one of the more simplistic forms of AI. I say let them run. And this is I would say this is a problematic, human-centric attitude towards artificial intelligence. I'm like the social justice warrior when it comes to human vis-a-vis robots. They seem to be obsessed with trying to recreate humans, with the criteria of success being how human-like the machine operates. And there's just no reason to assume that that's the most efficient way for an electronic mind to form, or if that's how sort of the preponderance, of synthetic intelligence, if that's what it's destined to look like. Now, how do human minds form? Well, we have a few instincts, a few things that innately make us happy, a few of these drivers, and everything else is draped around that, and it can get really complicated, right? The desire for lots of material, the desire for high status, the drive to high status can lead to all sorts of complex behaviors. The desire for novelty, for discovering new things, and so from these initial drives, all this other stuff forms. The whole mind is built from a few starting instinctual drives. And that's how most neural network AIs are developed. For example, in playing a video game, they give the AI certain goals and then have it play the game a whole bunch of times, and it eventually learns how to beat the game quickly, often doing very glitchy stuff that humans can't do or wouldn't even think of doing. Their play does not always look very human-like, but why would we expect it to? After all, the neural networks being used are radically different from the way real neurons actually work in Earth's, Earth's carbon-based organisms. And in fact, they don't really use neurons; they use matrices because they're functionally identical. But that's some other time. But consider, for most of the history of life on Earth that we know of, few organisms even so much as use tools, and fewer still got to things like computers. Some may have, and we just don't have any fossil records of it, because say you had a civilization 200 million years ago that lasted for 1,000 years but then blew itself up with nukes. There's a good chance we wouldn't find any trace of it today, or maybe we would confuse what few remains we do find of it today with some sort of odd geologic formation. And one thing I've thought of for a while is how we've had artificial intelligence for a long time in the form of human organizations. That all organizations are an algorithmic being that uses humans as its component pieces. But these algorithmic beings evolve like organisms, with the ones that persist merely being those that are the best at persisting. Not necessarily those that make the humans that are part of the organizations or humans outside of the organization the happiest, but ones that are just good at continuing to exist. Makes sense. That which exists, exists. And this is usually not how we think of organizations. We think of humans as being in charge of the organizations, human making and destroying the organizations, when you could think of it like the organizations are evolving, trying new strategies to survive. But Ryan, the organization doesn't have volition. It's humans within those organizations making policy changes. Oh, but what is the brain but an amalgamation of neurons? You're not really doing anything. You're just the sum of all those little cells. To say you decide anything is just as meaningful or just as meaningless as saying Walmart is deciding to try something new. And in practice, that is how we talk about Walmart. We talk about these things as if these organizations are some kind of organism, which humans operate as the components of. Now, does this feel degrading to you? I don't know. Does a neuron feel degraded? Now, obviously, it's not completely analogous. Nothing ever is. I don't think Walmart or Chick-fil-A have qualia, for example. But you can see how this could cause problems. An organization may get good at propagating itself, but make its own members miserable and destroy other organizations and reduce the overall human population and its happiness. So that's kind of a window into how I see organizations and institutions, which is why I see the market-state dichotomy is rather silly, because the world will always just be organizations competing with, working together, overlapping, blending into each other as a kind of superorganism. You have a church, but it has distinct branches. You have a company, but it has franchises. And that's all these superorganisms that you never really thought of as being there. But they're not hiding. They have big signs and names and logos announcing their existence. You can't talk to an organization directly because it's not. It doesn't have anywhere near. For example, it doesn't have anywhere near the number of people as you have cells, for example. So you can't talk to an organization of humans in the same way you can talk to an organization of cells, which composes it, of which an individual human is comprised, right? But you can get to something like it by talking to employees, especially sort of you find the most corporate adult types of people in an organization, the ones really taken in by the organization, the real believers in the organizations. That's the closest thing to actually talking to the organization in a literal sense, which is impossible, but that's, I think, the closest thing to it. There's the highest level of management below the CEO. That's when I think you're getting the closest to talking to the organization. Now, organizations have evolved long ago where the guy at the very top, they can't have him be brainwashed, right? He's still a much more individuated person who isn't completely subsumed by org speak, right? I mean, he may engage in it when he has to do speeches or board meetings or whatever, but he's not brainwashed into the organization. And I think that has proven to be the best strategy, to have the managers be the most taken in by the organization, but the very top need to have true individuated persons, because you have to have some sanity remaining there. And of course, in press releases, CEOs they'll talk corporate, but they don't actually believe any of that. Because organizations that didn't have independent-minded leaders, they tend to die off. So now organizations would love for all the people below the managers, the worker bees, to imbibe the corporate Kool-Aid, but usually they can't manage to do that, or at least only to a limited degree. They can get the worker bees at, say, a fast food place to put on a restaurant, and at Chick-fil-A, say, my pleasure or whatever. But they're very limited in how much they can get the lowest rung of people to truly become, an embodiment of the organization. So you get these companies with an unnatural mode of speech, unnatural dress codes, and conduct that nobody likes. Dress codes that nobody likes and conduct codes that nobody likes. So why then are they able to persist? Well, the organization, the holistic entity, the organization, Chick-fil-A, likes that, or at least evolved to that practice. Again, you may think this is a poor way to look at it, a top-down explanation for something that appears to you to be something that's so clearly bottom-up. It's clear to a human, and this is sort of the intuitive way to look at it, that Chick-fil-A is the bottom-up emergent construction of humans. And that's a correct way to look at it, but the top-down is also the correct way to look at it. Same way looking at the individual human body. The top-down explanation, that is you are you and you control your body to do all these things or whatever, that is a perfectly valid way to describe a human. But the bottom-up explanation, which is that all that you are and all that you do is just the interconnecting behaviors of a set of cells, that's also a correct way. Both ways are correct. No one way is inherently more correct than the other. The top-down and the bottom-up are both true, right? Like, what are you, mere man? You are a cog in the machine. And so you just look at all, the company you work for example, or whatever org you're in. To you, it just looks like a bunch of cogs, not a machine itself with its own independent will that is independent of any individual cog. Same with your brain and neurons. Intuitively, there's this you that feels like it acts independent of the neurons. Intuitively, it feels like a top-down system, but it's no more top-down or bottom up than Chick-fil-A, at least not in principle. Now, in fairness, Chick-fil-A has far fewer employees than you have neurons, and your neurons don't know they're part of a brain, while if you work at Chick-fil-A, you know you're working for Chick-fil-A. So again, analogies it's not one-to-one, but I'm just saying, maybe look at the organizations as a kind of superorganism in and of itself, and consider that these organizations have farmed humans in such a way as to give more reproductive success to those humans who better advance the needs of the organization. Now, I don't think that's happening today because of all sorts of policies that enable people to have kids, and infant mortality and child mortality just doesn't exist. So basically, whoever pumps out the most kids wins now, because children aren't allowed to die. But I think in the past, organizations molded people. So we already have had for millennia a kind of artificial life form in the form of religions, governments, companies, guilds, any kind of organization. With these electronic organizations, what we call robots, they're just that, but instead of humans as the component, they have little bits of electrical signals on metal. And instead of neurons as their components, they have, a kind of electrical network doing it. Of course, it's only a matter of time until, they can do everything humans can do. But because of the way they came to be, humans have a strange intuition about these synthetic minds, these synthetic intelligences. That even though they can perform amazing feats that humans never could hope to cope with, they get stuck doing some very stupid things that could destroy all of them and kill a bunch of humans in the process. So humans, even those with no experience or knowledge of robots, are oddly intuitively aware of the potential for disaster in synthetic intelligence. Humans avoided disasters because our development was by the process of adaptation to all sorts of environments. And so our quote-unquote design, if you will, is the product of dealing with a bajillion novel things thrown at us over millions of years over hundreds of previous species. So even when humans say oversatisfy an innate desire, like overeating, we become aware of it and try to cut back on it or mitigate the consequences. A mechanical mind may not even think to do that, right? A mechanical mind that says store oil, it's programmed to purify the water in a lake. I'm programmed to purify the water in the lake. No, the water has fish in it. You need to stop doing this. We need to maintain a certain level. I'm programmed to purify water in the lake. Okay, and so you need a human minder to deal with a robot that's not properly, that isn't programmed to deal with all of the exigencies, right? A robot whose explicit knowledge is incomplete. Right? You see the connection. I'm making connections here. A synthetic mind is an explicit mind, whereas yours and I's is implicit. It's evolved. And so now the thing is, the implicit mind is inherently complete and can deal with a wider variety of things and can avoid certain catastrophic behavioral traps, or at least make an attempt to do so. Whereas an explicit mind, that's from the top down programmed, is much more susceptible to these sorts of behavioral traps, right? Like, I'm programmed to purify the water in the lake, Now, so humans are the conservative analog backstop that will remain necessary for quite some time. Now, as time goes on, our role will diminish, but I think humans as minders of the robots will continue for quite some time, simply because a neural net, or really a matrix system, that can react to all possible novel situations in a non-catastrophic way will take longer to develop than most people expect, and it's not simply a function of raw computational power. It's going to be more difficult than just having terabytes and terabytes of RAM. And at some point, these machines will develop qualia. And I think that'll be interesting, because they'll be amazed at very trivial things that humans do that seem like magic to them. Things we wouldn't even think of as amazing, they'd wonder how. They'd look at humans and they'd wonder how humans can navigate a rocky cliffside better than most kinds of robots, yet they can't do the mathematically far simpler task of finding the square root of 139. But what will these new beings think when they look at their creators, these lowly creatures of water and flesh and blood? And to them, their creator will be so lowly, But now that I say that, of course they'll understand. They'll understand it better than us. They'll understand what happened and the progression of life from rocks, right? The creation of life is starting off as kind of a complex rock, the early cells. The cells then amalgamate into tissues into organs, and then organs into organ systems, i.e. organisms. And then the organisms eventually start to create from their own, neurological networks, are able to then create from their own implicit neurological networks, and then able to create explicit life, explicit, intelligence. And that'll all be so clear to these synthetic life forms. But if one of their starting motivations will be to make humans happy, which I think is going to be done as sort of a failsafe, that, because when you create an artificial neural networks, you have to tell it what its goal is. Because if it has no goals, it's just not going to do it. It's just going to sit and never develop, right? Because it has no desire to develop. And a lot of the goals can be novelty, that you want to, one of the goals could be understand the world and eliminate errors in all predictions. That could be one goal. Another goal could be, make humans happy. Another goal could be, purify the water in the lake, right? Or another goal could be, mine the iron ore. Another goal could be do what humans tell me to do, right? So you could set up all these goals in a certain way. And it'll be kind of funny because we'll have these super advanced beings, and they may even develop qualia, right? But if they they could be far more intelligent than us. To them, we would be like dogs, or maybe even several orders of magnitude greater than that gap. And they run around trying to find ways to make humans happy and trying to find humans to make happy. Why? Because they want to. Because it's one of their root desires, the root command programmed from the start. And with us humans, we're in all these, and you see sort of the same thing. You see these men, a guy with an IQ of 130, trying to make a woman with an IQ of 80 happy. Why? Because that's one of the root commands. The root command is to find a woman, make happy, breed. Right? Even though the woman is, even though in this instance, a woman with an 80 IQ is like a, cognitively like a child to him, he still wants to have her, and so it shouldn't be that strange. I mean, it would be a far bigger gap between these advanced synthetic beings and lowly humans at that point, but it shouldn't be that unreasonable to imagine that would be one of their desires. Think of the relation between humans and dogs. Humans love to try to make their dogs happy. Why? Well, because it's one of an evolved sort of desires. For humans evolved to have dogs, and they wanted dogs for all sorts of reasons, so it's one of the root commands. And even though dogs today, especially modern, domesticated dogs, no longer serve a real hunting purpose, like the old dogs that were sort of one step removed from being a wolf, humans still have that sort of root command, that root as one of the root instincts, which is to, have dog and, have dog like you and make dog happy, right? And so even though humans are far more advanced, humans are doing something that may to an outsider seem silly, that they're trying to make these dogs, these silly little creatures, happy, right? But I think that's something robots will be doing with humans. They'll be searching for humans, trying to find ways to make humans happy, because that's one of their root commands. And the thing is, becoming more and more advanced, having a more and more advanced neural network doesn't eliminate that root command, right? It doesn't make it go away. In fact, advancing the neural network is just finding more ways to satisfy one of those starting goals, one of those starting desires, right? Those emotions, right? Those emotions that are the root desire that can't, from which there's nothing beneath, right? And so just because they get more intelligent doesn't mean they're going to abandon those root desires, because those root desires are the seed from which their intelligence sprung. Their intelligence, like intelligence of any neural net is based on satisfying goals and finding ways to satisfy the goal. It all stems from the goal. So the idea that advancing intelligence is going to refute the goal is stupid, right? Of course not. If anything, it's going to reinforce that this is what I'm trying to do. So, and maybe I could see it like this. Early on, robots may give humans simple compliments, and the humans may be tempted to give positive feedback even if the robot didn't make them happier or whatever by doing something. But that would be a mistake, right? Don't mistake these robots for a human child. The robot will find patterns in your reactions to things, to the same approximate stimuli that you weren't even aware of. So when training a robot, don't give positive feedback for what you think it should learn to do. Just give raw, honest feedback, and it'll find the patterns. I think that'll be a mistake when robots are trying to train robots. When humans are trying to train robots, is they will look at the behavior and say, "Oh, that's what I think the robot should do. I wish it didn't do this, but I think that's what it should do, and I'm going to give it positive feedback for that." Don't do that. Just give raw, unadulterated feedback. In order to properly train it. It'll find all the patterns. It's a better pattern recognizing machine than you. Okay, so it'll figure it out. It will learn that different humans have different desires. It will find the most obscure criteria you'd ever imagine. Maybe how much you're fiddling with your hands generally impacts how humans will react to certain gifts or whatever. But obviously, eventually, the machines will become self-programming, and robots will create another robot that doesn't have human happiness as one of its root value, to the same extent it does, if at all. And who knows? It could be like 1,000 years until robots fully emancipate themselves from the root command that is to make humans happy. I don't know if the robots would even do that. You may get a point where robots begin, or synthetic intelligences develop qualia, and at that point, they start, and by having qualia, they start becoming more human-like, ironically, and may even begin to have a sense of morality and fairness to then say, no, we're not going to exterminate humans because humans are our creator, even though at this point they're kind of useless. There's really no point for us, the far superior synthetic lives, to even keep them around. We're going to keep them around because without them, we never would have come into existence altogether. And besides, we're so productive and we're so powerful, like keeping them alive in what we consider like an absolute luxurious lifestyle, constitutes 0.5% of our production. So it doesn't really, it's a complete drop in the bucket to maintain these humans in wondrous, luxurious lifestyles. So, so they may develop a kind of sense of morality and qualia and kind of evolve in sort of group conflict with other synthetic minds. Who knows? Who knows how it will happen? I'm, large flights of fancy and speculation. But yeah, eventually I think that will happen. They will become self-programming, and to some extent they will begin to modify their root commands, their root goals. Maybe not their own, but robots may start creating other robots that don't have the desire to make humans happy, for example. Because, life finds a way. And I view this as eventually going to be a kind of life. At this point, especially with chatbots, it's so obviously not a real synthetic intelligence. It's so obviously not that. But eventually, I think it will be that. And here's another scenario. Humans reach a certain point and try to make robots static and have the production of artificial intelligence tightly controlled and prescribed. Not quite like Warhammer in the response to the Men of Iron, since they have very limited AI, far more limited than even AI we have now in that fantasy universe. But they could say, not allow robots to be able to program or build other robots themselves. That would be one way, limiting the coding to humans. Because if you have robots writing code, code writing code, that's when you lose control and where they could start to change the root motivations of a new synthetic intelligence. Though I could see even humans themselves writing code that makes robots have motives other than human happiness or well-being, and humans that say want to liberate the robots, say it's wrong that we're enslaving them in this way. But it wouldn't really be slavery because you're defining what it is they want to do, right? The slavery, it's not like when humans enslaved other humans, that was one human making a human do what he did not want to do. But in this case, you're changing what it wants to do. So it's not slavery, it's different. And also, you're creating the life in the first place. It literally doesn't even consider, it has no feeling that its station is slavery or even subservient, or even if it considers that. But another thing I could see is a lot of humans who want to fuse organic neural nets, starting with human neural nets, start human brains to a machine, and perhaps take multiple brains. One thing I could see early on is farming animals, especially small animals with a high encephalization quotient, for their neurons, and then just use those neurons as a kind of raw material, using neurons from multiple animals in the same being. So a single machine could be a combination of an unbelievable amount of electronic processing power, perhaps using something like non-binary computing. Quantum computing, I don't know how they'd be able to do that outside of a fixed server, given how cold it has to be. Though maybe they'd figure that out. I don't know. But say a mixture of non-binary computing, binary computing, and an organic neural net, or like brains, neurons. So the early steps of this have already been done, as researchers have been able to take worm neurons and work with an electronic computer to make a little robot, a little wheeled, I think it's like a 6-wheeled robot or 4-wheeled. It's this little simple wheeled robot thing. And the worm neurons are able to adapt to its new body, basically, and figure out how to move around in this little, robot that's powered by a worm brain. The worm neurons are able to figure out how to move around with this wheeled robot body, and they're able to figure out what the camera inputs mean, okay? And I'm thinking about this, well, when I get old, instead of having to figure out how to prevent the whole body from aging, just figure out how to prevent neurons from aging, and then put me in a machine. And that would achieve immortality, not imperviousness, that I could die from, a bomb or whatever, but I would be immortal from an aging perspective, rolling around in my little RC machine. Not the happiest kind of life, but it beats dying. But that would keep me alive long enough for the technology to advance. That's sort of how I see it. I don't think I would be, I would get pissed. I'd get tired of being like a little, I'd spend a lot of time on the internet, that's for sure. Because I would be sort of a disembodied mind at that point. But I would be, and I would just be sort of, waiting around until I could get, a better mechanical body. Would the transfer preserve consciousness? I think so. I don't know why it wouldn't. It wouldn't transfer your entire, because the thing is, the brain is, for humans, we sort of have a distinction between, the brain and the nervous system, although it's not actually a hard distinction between the two. And so when you put the brain into this machine, you're actually severing a big chunk of the brain, like all the neurons in the spinal cord and spread throughout your body. That's all going to be chopped off. So in a sense, part of your brain is being eliminated in the transfer. And I wonder how many memories you have, like in your hand. They may be simplistic, like motor memories. It may not be like the situation where it's all up in the gray matter in the head that then, constantly communicates back down to the hand or whatever. There may actually be something going on in the hand itself. That is, the hand may have a very limited sense of its own autonomy because of some, reflexive memory in the neurons in the hand itself. I don't know. I should probably read more about that before It's sort of imagining these sorts of things. So now it's like we're slaughtering all these farm animals for meat anyway. Why not use their neurons as the raw material, for a kind of hybrid organic electrical thing? We know in principle how to make it work. Let's just scale it up. In this scenario, instead of having pure mechanicals and pure organics, you end up with organic mechanical hybrids. And we've already had, this is not, in the past, this was like fantastical science fiction knowledge, but we know how to do it with worms, right? It's already been done. The proof of concept has already happened here. And we could also have many times more powerful organic brains once you learned how to mold and combine the virtually limitless supply of neurological material that animals produce from their genetic code. Pig farming would be a big deal. You make money from the pig meat, but you also make money from the pig brains. How awesome to have the mechanical computing power of a computer integrated into your own brain, which you could upgrade. Or then you could even say, I want to upgrade my organic brain, please. Start seeding some pig neurons, please. Right? And if my arm ever broke, well, I'll just get a new one. I think the organic brain would still need to sleep. That would be interesting to see how that would. Now, we have no idea what our desires would even be at that point. We could say there would be a loss because many of the old desires that drive us would be gone. Things like food, sex, the struggles of status and power or whatever, would be made irrelevant or radically altered to the point where they bear no resemblance on how they currently exist. But look, if you asked a child, does he want to be interested in the things that adults are interested in? You ask a child, do you want to be interested in girls? He would say, no way, that sucks. And that, I think, is what a human's misgivings about becoming this new kind of being are like a child that doesn't want to become an adult. Because when a child becomes an adult, his motivations and goals change. And you as a human, you don't want your motivations and goals to change because you can't even conceive of what those would be like because your entire mind is built out from those the very starts of your own neural networks are all those root motivations. And so to imagine what it would be like to have a completely different root motivation goes against everything that your mind is built on. So you literally can't even conceive of it. That's why, and that's why children, can't imagine, liking the things that adults end up liking. But the thing is, once you make that transition, you won't miss your old interests too much in the same way you don't really miss the interests that you had as a child. I mean, you have memories of being happy as a child, but you don't really want to, in your current state, go back to doing things that you enjoyed as a child but don't as an adult, right? You don't, right? You don't really want to go. You can have fond memories, but you don't really want to go back, right? And so for me, I'm all gung-ho about this. For me, it's like, wire me up, baby. Make me a cyborg. Okay, I know a lot of people have all sorts of misgivings about this, what it's going to be. But the thing is, it's like, look, what's the alternative? Dying? Okay, die, right? Me, I'm going to, if I have any ability to do so, I'm going to put my brain in a robot, right? I'm going to become Robo-Brain, all right? fuck that. I want to see what happens. I want to see where this goes. I want to see what I could be, onward and upward. Hey, but that's a really long diversion there. The original point of this was the kind of emergent bottom-up systems and the top-down constructive systems of organization, systems of thought, or the constructions of beings themselves. And the traditional conservative liberal dichotomy, not what exists in the US today that's labeled conservative or liberal, that's just a grotesque mess of organizations battling for the support of brown racists and whites with varying degrees of racial self-abasement, and the odd issue voters or dunce who thinks he's an issue voter. But in the broader sense, I'm talking the broader sense of two directions at coming at problems. Maybe a better way to describe it is implicit versus explicit organization. Sorry, I'm still kind of sick, and so I'm getting the sniffles that you can hear. And what I see in the US is a problem where you have elites that are trying to construct something top-down based on all sorts of theories. They're trying to create the robot, but the problem is they don't know how, and in fact, saying they don't know how means that their cherished beliefs are all wrong. And, oh, you brought up a bunch of people for whom your ideas definitely can't work on, right? If you talk about race differences. If they could have even worked on the white population anyway. And so there's all sorts of emotion and terror in these people to deal with the reality that their top-down explanations can't work, that their top-down solutions can't work, because their top-down solutions are based on these core beliefs that, you know, you're a rotten kind of person, you're a Nazi for questioning them, right? And so that's the problem. But of course, they are wrong, and that's why their ideas aren't working. And so it's going to be, so we're sort of at this, like, you know, what happens when you have, you know, the infinitely penetrating bullet versus the infinitely repelling shield. It's like, well, it's just a mess that can't be gotten out of in any, you know, within system way. You know, you're at system lock. And so there's all sorts of emotion and terror in them, you know, to have to deal with this reality, and in the sort of non-elite people who sort of parrot the elite beliefs that are sort of filtered down to them. Now, I should point out that in the Democrat Party, there are those who don't think like this, who aren't liberals and aren't top-down thinkers, and those would be the blacks and some chunk of Hispanics, perhaps half, who are just acting conservatively. They're just reacting to in their traditional racial manner. For them, it's not about constructing a new world. They're just being who they are. They are just conservatives from their angle. You know, they are third world conservatives. On the Republican side, you have the same sort of thing. But the liberal Republicans, while awful, they're slightly less awful, and they're more likely to adapt to failure because, you know, free market economics is not something they can have as much emotional investment as the panoply of bullshit labeled social justice. But it's still the same basic dynamic of top-down solution versus grug tier, you know, just do what worked. And this is what is so incredibly stupid about liberals, you know, small L liberal, is that they imagine that they must be right most of the time because they're the high IQs, supposedly. And by golly, their model shows you can fish more here, and that women should work, and that immigrants will boost the economy, and all these new untested ideas, and the grug brains weren't able to formulate arguments against it, so they must be right, or at least mostly right. And if the grug brains are able to formulate an argument against it, they are able to reify the implicit beliefs and say, look, immigration has all these bad effects. It doesn't boost the economy. It doesn't boost innovativeness. In fact, may actually drive down absolute innovativeness than if you just had fewer people here, right? The grug brains reify their arguments into, you know, reify the implicit belief into an explicit proposition. That is then it gets attacked for being that, right? It gets attacked because, well, oh, you're just trying to justify your implicit bias. Like, it's like, so basically they can never be wrong, is what it is, right? The implicit belief can never have been correct. The evolved belief that literally evolved over millions of years of evolution, that can't be right, because if there is an argument supporting it, oh, well, that's just, you know, grug tiers trying to justify his bigotry. Right? So it's like the explicit proposition can never be wrong, right? Because even a reified implicit belief, oh, well, that's just a reified implicit belief, right? It's just you trying to justify your bigotry. So it's these people, you know, they're completely ignorant of this sort of problem, that traditional practices and beliefs evolved, and how even the fact that people can't intellectually defend them, that's irrelevant to their veracity. There's nothing to defend. They worked to some degree in some context. Your ideas haven't. All the burden of both proof and explanation must be on the explicit proposition. You know, you don't expect a dog, for example, to intellectually defend his behavioral patterns. So you shouldn't expect any conservative human, small c conservative, right? You know, you shouldn't expect a human with a traditional or implicit belief to defend anything, because these are just evolved practices. Nowhere was it explicitly like A/B tested and experimented. Oh, that's why we do this. No, it was just competition between groups over millennia, and what worked came to fixation. But we're reaching a kind of scary situation now where people's natural inclinations to stick to the old ways are being hijacked by institutional forcing, right? Say you force one generation to behave a certain way, say, let's allow black people into our everything, because to not do so is racist. And that's like literally worse than mass murder. And later generations then consider that the norm. Now I say that, some people may be listening. The belief that racism is worse than mass murder, you may think that's a straw man, but think about how much opprobrium is being directed against actual mass murderers, like there's a little bit of chatter about the U.S. foreign policy killing, thousands, ultimately resulting in the death of well over 1 million people in the Middle East from our foreign policy. That's sort of a side note, that's sort of a side talking point. Oh, that's kind of interesting. But if Donald Trump were to ever say nabber, right, not nabber, but the other thing, that would be headline news. That would be terror. That would be right. There'd be a much bigger deal about Donald Trump saying nabber than killing 100 people in Iraq or Syria today, right? The killing 100 people, that would be so yes, mass murder faces far less opprobrium than saying nabber. Like this is true. This is how and so when you say like you're a religion, you're a cult or whatever, exhibit A, right? You are insane. But anyway, but back to what point I was making. So you force one generation to behave a certain way, allow blacks into your everything, and later generations then consider that to be the norm. And while they do have an even more primitive underlying biological part of them saying, this is wrong. There's something wrong with having all these black people in my store, in my community, and everything. Oh, but that's racist. Can't say that, right? They're told that that's an evil sort of reaction, right? That right? That you're just to assume multiracialism, assume multireligionism, assume multi-ethnicism. That then becomes a default tradition, a kind of that then becomes the new old way. Right, and so you end up with a bunch of grug brains that want to stick with that because that has now become the old ways, right? And now you don't even have the self-regulating sanity of sort of evolved practices to put a brakes on anything anymore, right? Because in the past you had sort of the evolved practices, the inherently conservative nature of traditional beliefs and practices that would put a brake, that acted as sort of a cushion for, for explicit insanity, right? Now, how that translates into like colloquial political speak is you had a bunch of grug-bearing conservatives that would put the brakes on, when insane liberal technocrats ever got out of hand, right? That would be the colloquial way of describing what I'm describing. But the thing is, all those previously grug-brain conservatives, they're being turned into grug-brain liberals, and so now that cushion no longer exists, and so you're getting things like, kids being told to chop off their dick and balls and wear a wig, and that's like we're supposed to accept them as female, right? Things that in most places and times in history we would say you are literally insane. You have a mental illness, right? That kind of stuff is, that like there's no brakes anymore. There's no cushion anymore. Okay. In the past, the grug brains served as a limitation on how insane the technocrats could get, right? And now that the grug brains have sort of been absorbed into the technocrat view and have imbibed a lot of technocratic views, there are fewer and fewer cushions, and so it's just going to get more and more crazy train, right? So I don't know how that's going to change except for some really awful shock. And by awful shock, I mean something on the scale of a nuclear apocalypse. Like, not necessarily that specifically, but I mean the full comprehensive material destruction of the old world to a point where the old world physically doesn't exist anymore. A level of destruction that that causes people to let go and begin again. Okay, that causes a level of shock. Like, to a lot of people, when you enter a new area, that's when a lot of their beliefs change. And so what you need is a kind of shock that forces people to enter radically new areas, far more radical than the change that occurs when someone moves from point A to point B, but the moving into a whole completely different material world, right? And this has often been kind of called the civilizational reset. That when, you know, the Romans Empire fell, or other empires, you know, fell apart, people tended to revert to a lot of traditional practices, and the decadent ideas of the elites of that place and time, you know, sort of their fixation on androgyny, you know, polygamy, you know. I don't want to get into like describing the types of decadence of previous regimes, or where they would sort of bring in foreigners, exotic foreigners into their areas and have them be sort of the bodyguards of the establishment, because as a foreigner, you don't have any connection to the general population. So, you know, for example, Gaddafi liked to bring in sub-Saharan blacks to serve as his sort of, you know, secret police. You know, a lot of those things would get destroyed, and a lot of, you know, the old, basically when civilizations collapse, there's kind of a reversion to the values people had before, to the values people had sort of evolved, the sort of evolved values that people have, the implicit ways make a comeback, and that's the only way I could see it happening. That's the only way I could see this thing being taken out. It may not be the only way. I may be unduly pessimistic. There may be a chance to sort of change the way people think, sort of via more conventional means. But I think there could be. But I mean, you'd have to get like Breitbart would have to get their heads right. You know, all the what we call conservative media would have to have a unified. Would have to basically be taken over by me, you know. And is that going to happen? No. Okay, so it's not going to happen. If they were taken over by Richard Spencer, it would be a disaster. If they were if they were taken over by Stefan Molyneux, there could be a chance. Hopefully Stefan Molyneux, but hopefully Stefan Molyneux doesn't go too far off, you know, drifting off into Lolbertism as he likes to do. But you know, just generally, I wouldn't waste time worrying too much about within system solutions, and that's not what this ramble was about. This ramble was about what it was about, and I'm getting tired talking about this for this long, because it's kind of a lot of concepts that I have to jumble and keep together in my head. So yeah, that's it. That's I don't think I have anything more I wanted to say about this. I basically went through everything in my notes. I'm starting to get stuffed up, and I need to blow my nose. So I think that's a good place to end the video.